Welcome to Would You Consider? This is the podcast where I sit down with Mark Dangelo and we talk about the topics that everyone should be talking about in business right now. Today, our topic is data governance. Now, if you watched the last show, you probably saw data privacy. We talked about that. Mark gave us some great insight. We bring him back, well, we're always going to bring him back, but this time to talk about data governance. Mark, thanks for being here.
Thanks again for being part of this.
All right, so data governance now, what are we talking about?
Data governance is a topic that's been around, since the computer age started back in the 60s and 70s that we know today. And it's really around the idea of how do we manage our information? Who controls it? Who has access to it? And again, part of that is data privacy, as you already mentioned, but part of it also is data security, data integrity. How long is that data good for? So there's a duration, a shelf life. Is it manipulated data? Is it data that's fed into an analytics system, and how is that rolled up? So data governance talks about who owns and who grants that informational access, because in the world we now live in, people start talking about data democratization, and that is another very key topic underneath governance. But the ability for people to use data effectively when they need it to actually be able to help the corporation, help the consumer, help the regulators, to be able to satisfy regulatory compliance. So it is a set of parameters by which we manage not just the access, but even the resiliency of that information. So, how is it backed up? Where is it recovered? Is it in an industry cloud, for instance, like a Microsoft industry cloud or a Snowflake or whatever the application is? How is that managed? And then we even start layering on top of data governance the ability to say, is it sovereign data? Basically saying, if I'm in a different country or I'm in a different state, my information cannot go outside of those boundaries. What does that do? That's all part of a data governance conversation that is extremely complex. And one more thing I should say to kind of set the stage for that is that data governance used to be a very passive type of approach. We set data governors and caretakers and stewards. We had all these great names for them, and they were very passive. And so if you wanted access, you sent in a request. The request maybe took a couple of days. Somebody approved it. Then they granted you access to the database or the data store. And that's kind of the way it worked. Today, information is flooding in a volume we can't even comprehend. The volumes are off the charts. And so this is where data governance comes in. It's like, how do I deal with this? And one last point to give you an idea of how governance is so complex and so big. To train actually something like a ChatGPT or an equivalent in Google or whoever, everybody's like, oh, well, that just takes, a certain amount of data, like gigabytes or whatever. Now it takes roughly about 50 terabytes to train just the rudimentary basics for a generative AI, which is what ChatGPT is. Data is becoming just, monstrous. It's mountains of this stuff. And so data governance is going to be a huge corporate asset as well as a liability moving forward on who gets it, what do they get, and what did they see?
Wow. All right. So tell me this, why isn't that conversation just something that's happening in the CIO's office and doesn't really impact the rest of the organization? Why is this important for enterprises to be talking throughout the C-suite about right now?
Well, one of the key drivers of this, and you're seeing this it's almost like an implication of the regulations on the privacy side that we mentioned before. One of that is actually how that information is used, stored, and who has access to it. And so they're actually almost setting up data, I don't want to call them data farms, but these data lakes that basically say, if you're going to subscribe to this privacy and security, then you subscribe to also the access and the capability use rules of doing that. And the other thing that is interesting to note, in most industries, over half of their information that they use comes from outside their corporate walls. We used to be in a centralized database mindset. If you were an IBM shop, you always kept that in DB2 or something like that. If you're an Oracle shop, well, obviously you're an Oracle, and that could be like Cerner software. Everybody uses this stuff and kept it internally. But when more and more of this information is created, now we have more of these partnership virtualization types of relationships that are tentacles like an octopus, but they're not 8, they're probably 50 to 100 right now. How do you deal with all those APIs, those feeds? Is it valid? And we begin to bring that information like it's been vetted, but we don't know for sure. And this is where data governance and the ability to control that information is so critical, because if that information is erroneous and we're making decisions off it, that's a problem. And oftentimes, how many times do we go into an organization and find that they're making decisions off, 1990 spreadsheets and or systems that are off to the side, or one of my favorites was, a $2 billion organization that was making all their data decisions off a 16-bit Clipper database that was surrounded by technology and 30 years out of date. And down 8 hours a day. But this is where data governance comes in, is how do you use that information? And it's a web of information. It's not just a single pipe anymore. That's why it's so important, because the data is transcending our enterprise walls. And that is more and more of the challenge, especially with partner relationships. How do you integrate that? What does that mean? And that's why data governance is going from a passive to an active type of a mindset, because we have to be able to make decisions much quicker. We have to be able to assess the implications of that data, the validity of that data before we ingest it, and then produce our own things. And so we blast it out, and then how do you recall it? That's also part of the data governance, because if that information is incorrect and it's a customer incorrect, that replicates through the entire set of systems. That is something that has to be recalled. And this is where data governance gets down, rubber meets the road. There's some very unique and distinct conversations that have to happen. And we always just kind of wave a wand. It's like the cloud, it exists up here. But that's one of the things too, is that cloud has become generational. It's become ubiquitous. And the more that information is put out there, the more and more data governance becomes a priority for organizations, more than the ability to provision something in the cloud.
All right. Well, that's horrifying as well, Mark, because I'm just picturing all
I'm glad to help. I'm glad to help.
The vast variety of different enterprises we have in so many different industries. Each of these conversations is going to be different. Each of these is going to depend on different variables in their environment, internal and external. So we'll talk later in the show about how we go deep dive into some of these topics. But if you were advising someone about how to start this conversation in their enterprise, who would be involved and what should they consider?
The people to be involved are actually the people that own the information. This may be divisional, this may be departmental, but whoever owns the data, those are the folks that are going to be responsible for saying, how is that information used? How valid is it? What can be done? And as part of that, it's not just on a per department basis. It's saying, from a customer standpoint, a satisfaction, a product or service line, whatever we're offering to our customers, what's the priority? And then what's the information that goes into that line? Where does it come from? And so we begin to understand, the interconnections of that. And then there's a ranking of those. This is how you start it, because it is so complex. It is so mind-numbing that you can get lost in the stratosphere on this and never come down to earth. What you've got to do is say, what are my key principles? Who are the key participants, the stakeholders, sometimes people are referred to them, versus stewards, and get them involved as part of solving or delivering the product and service to the customer. And then you're basically ratcheting this down. It's like a funnel. You're kind of narrowing to the neck and saying, this is the one we're focusing in on, and let us take our data governance principles, our practices, our methods, and let's begin to apply them and automate them throughout the entire data stream. And again, we need to think of data as a product. And this is a shift of mindset, saying we used to think everything was a system, from fintech to regtech to something off the shelf from an SAP system. We'd go out and buy this, but data was the secondary. Today, data is the primary. And so that is a shift level thinking of how to engage all these folks and apply them. Data as a product is a real solution. And we're seeing, even some of the big consulting firms begin to try to put empirical data behind this. And they're showing that people that focus on data are actually going to be more profitable and have been more profitable, even on things like mergers and acquisitions. So it's a shift of a mindset, not a comprehensive, but it's a couple of degrees difference, and saying we're going from system level ideation to a data ideation. And that's the primary. The systems just happen to use the data. And this is how you begin to transform the organization from this this passive mindset to something that is more overtly active.
All right, so if you've seen our show before, you know that this is our topic introduction. This is where we talk about what we all should be talking about. But the deep dive shows that are going to come afterward, we're going to reach out, Mark and I, we're going to find sources, experts who can talk about this for their own industries on a much deeper level, and we'll see where it takes us. All right, Mark, as always, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next time.